Something as huge as a civilian airliner getting blown out of the sky, solving the mystery of what happened and whose instigation, well, that's the work of highly trained security experts, right? Well, not anymore. Citizen investigators using new techniques to verify evidence trails across social media have shown that they can sometimes, even often, do a better job than the pros. And the case that first demonstrated this was the downing of flight MH17. Let's take a look. In the world of claim and counterclaim, how do we have a chance of knowing what's real and what's fake? And this is obviously a live question right now. I mean, it has been for a number of years. We've seen information being used as a weapon. We've seen the rise of genuine disinformation as well as claims of disinformation. There are no political traditions, no social movements, no countries, no ideologies that have been beyond using disinformation. For some, it's an occasional indulgence. For others, it's a crucial underpinning to an enterprise that would otherwise collapse. Those of us who care more about the truth of what's going on than we care about the campaign or the cause or whatever it may be, how can we hope to get a handle on reality? It is probably an endless process like keeping fit, but one crowdsourced initiative has really come to prominence during the Ukraine war, which is open source intelligence. A growing army of independent volunteers have been scrutinising evidence that appears on social media, locating it, verifying it or not, and sharing the results. And from the beginnings, just a few years ago, more and more tools are appearing to help to do this process, most of which are free and available to anyone online. Now, of course, there are always extremes. Some of the things that appear in the public arena are obviously ridiculous and fake, not much expertise required in order to spot them. Such as, for example, this image that was used to pretend that the whole Ukraine war was being acted out, which was quickly and easily identified as a behind-the-scenes photo of a movie, Contamin. And then this one, claimed by some and retweeted by others who really should have known better, suggesting that this scene with body bags was also from the Ukraine war, where several could be seen moving, so it was a similar setup. But again, the footage was quickly traced to be that from an eco-protest. The joy of having presenters wearing masks is, of course, you can dub any old crap over them and nobody's any the wiser that that wasn't actually what they were saying. But more sophisticated actors put up false trails and false flag actions and all sorts. It takes more attention to detail, focused on real evidence and application to get to the truth. Let's look at one of the earliest examples of open source intelligence in action, which was how volunteers using the internet pursued the question of who shot down the passenger airliner MH17. So let's recap what happened. On 17th of July 2014, a Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 left Amsterdam with 298 people on board, flying to Kuala Lumpur. As the flight crossed eastern Ukraine, it was hit by an explosion and crashed with the loss of all lives. Eastern Ukraine, we now all know extremely well, is home to the breakaway republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, where pro-Russian militants had been in conflict with the Ukraine state. This had become an armed conflict just a few months before this incident took place. As we've become used to, competing narratives were quickly all over the internet. The usual thing you can find in any comment section, fantastic and serious claims without the slightest evidence to support them. And the pro-Russia rebels were themselves saying that it could not have been them because they don't have that weaponry. They don't have weaponry capable of shooting down a plane at that altitude, which to everyone's best knowledge was true. And then the Ukrainian government was saying it wasn't them, and so on and so on. But increasingly, in the era where almost everyone has a camera in their pocket, and when things attract their attention, things being out of the ordinary, they often get photoed and posted to social media. So The first one to be noticed was a brief film clip on YouTube claiming to show the murder weapon, a Buck missile launcher driven down a road in a wooded residential area, and this was reported to be Snizhne, a town located within the territory controlled by the insurgents. If it was genuine, then it would be very important. Buck missile launchers would certainly be capable of hitting a plane at the altitude of MH17. The Buck missile system was designed during the Soviet era, started being used in 1980. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, both Russia and Ukraine had such weaponry in their arsenals. It contains a battery of 4 missiles, and the point is that it's a surface-to-air missile that is highly mobile. If one of those had been moving through the territory controlled by the insurgents on the day of the attack, that would certainly challenge the claim that such weapons weren't available to them. And then the question would be, where would it come from? Eliot Higgins, who was one of the pioneers of open source investigation and had formed the Bellingcat agency just 3 days earlier, downloaded the video clip as soon as he saw it, catching it just hours before it disappeared. He had found in researching the Syria conflict that important clips would often disappear soon after you saw them, as this one did, just a few hours later in fact, so you had to grab them as soon as you saw them. He then looked for landmarks that could help to verify the location of where it was taken, because so far you only had the poster's word for the idea that it was in Snizhne. As we know, people sometimes lie. He invited his fellow volunteers via Twitter to see if they could identify anywhere in Snizhne that fitted the layout. The road had 2 lanes and a median divider with trees. At first glance, using satellite images didn't seem to match what you would see in that town, but very quickly people started to point to an area south of the centre, a 2-lane road with the right layout of trees and a slight bend in the road as well, as seen in the video. So that gave a starting hypothesis. Next they had to work out where the camera shooting the video would have been located. There has to be a location where the other features that are seen in the image would all line up with the right perspective. The footage had been shot at a downward angle, suggesting that it was on higher ground. Using Google Earth, Higgins identified that there were apartment buildings, and testing this as the camera's location, it came out with a match for landmarks in the video: 3 specific trees, junctions in the road, and the red roof of a house. So this confirmed that the Buck missile launcher had been leaving Snizhne, heading south. That's just one piece of evidence. Solid, but it doesn't prove a whole lot on its own. It doesn't prove that it was a Buck that shot down the airliner. It doesn't prove that it was this particular Buck, nor indeed who was in control of it. Nevertheless, it was a start. Meanwhile, claims and counterclaims were flying. The Russian Defense Ministry was saying that it had been a Buck missile system that had shot down the plane, but it came from Ukraine-controlled territory. A Russian operative suggested that it had been a false flag operation, that the airline had taken off with dead bodies inside and was shot down in order to frame the insurgents. That is an odd claim. I mean, these weren't random dead bodies on this flight. There were known passengers with names who went missing. Around 100 of them were HIV/AIDS specialists who were on their way to a conference in Melbourne. Very hard to see how that's supposed to have worked. A new photo was found to have been posted on Twitter of a Buck. It didn't provide much detail. It was a parking area in the foreground, perhaps a petrol station, the yellow sign of a shop. Again, the location was reported as being Snizhne. Another volunteer spent time trying to identify that location. A long process, too detailed to go into step by step here. Based on identifying words in the shop sign and doing variations on searches of it, he eventually found a video on YouTube that had someone driving around the area with a dash cam, which is a popular thing to do in some Eastern European countries, fortuitously. And there it was, the store. Every landmark matched, and it was actually in Torres. Having identified where the garage image was taken, they then needed to work out the time of day the photo was taken. This uses another tool that is now a standard for this sort of investigation, an app for photographers called SunCalc. Give it a photo and a location, and it will calculate from the position of the sun what the approximate time was. Turns out it was around 12:30 p.m. Another blogger interested in military hardware came across a photo of a buck also taken that day. It was moving on its own tank tracks, not on a flatbed truck. The Ukraine government then provided a video which showed the flatbed with a buck passing through a static video cam site, reportedly after the airliner had been shot down. The buck was heading in the direction of the Russian border, and it was the same as before, except that one missile was missing. At this point, the Russian government made a move of its own to push back on the emerging narrative. It set up a presentation by some of its generals, which was broadcast live on the RT station, formerly Russia Today. And they made 4 claims. 1, that the Ukrainians had deliberately changed the flight path of MH17 to pass over the war zone. 2, that Russian radar had shown a Ukrainian aircraft near MH17, suggesting that Kiev's military had shot the plane down. 3, that a Buck missile system belonging to Ukraine left a military base before MH17 went down, and that 2 Bucks were in a field in Ukrainian-held areas where a missile was fired. And 4, that the video the Ukrainian government released showing a buck on a flatbed, that wasn't filmed in separatist territory, but in Ukrainian-held Krasnoyarsk. And to prove it, they highlighted a feature in the video with a car dealership billboard that showed an address that was in that town. What should immediately jump out, at least to regular viewers of this channel, is that those 4 parts don't join up to make any kind of coherent whole. So wait, are you saying a Ukrainian plane shot it down, or that a Ukrainian buck shot it down? You just said it was both. Higgins and his collaborators concluded that the purpose of the presentation was just to scatter doubt, not to make a case, which is a standard disinformation technique. The argument about the location of the Ukrainian government source video quickly fell apart. A street view from Yandex Maps showed the match for the view in one of the insurgents' outposts in Luhansk. Another blogger found a website that broadcast traffic cameras from the area, one of which showed the same billboard. And finally, a local in the city physically went to the location, took photos and posted them on the Russian blogging site LiveJournal. He also took a close-up of the car dealership billboard, showing that actually there was no address whatsoever in the place that the Russians had suggested. That had just been outright falsified. In response to the Russian generals, the US tweeted a satellite image which the supposed launch site of the missile was indicated. But it was a poor quality graphic, gave no source, and didn't really make much of a contribution. And one news headline at the time said it all. Group of bloggers unearthing MH17 intel quicker than US spies. Meanwhile, that work continued. Another picture emerged, published by the magazine Paris Match, which gave a closer and clearer shot of the truck than any of the others to date. The magazine believed the picture to have been taken in Schnitschner, but the open source sleuths decided to check anyway. Even Paris Match would not be taken at its word. And this involved someone mapping the route that took in the different places already seen, and then going bit by bit on the Google Maps street view along that entire route until they found the surroundings that matched. Long, tedious process, but it worked. And they eventually matched it to Donetsk instead. And that's the power of this. There were dedicated volunteers sitting at their computer prepared to put that time in. No journalist is going to do that. I mean, they have a deadline, they can't afford it. Probably security services could do it, but at that point they certainly weren't. And the person who did do it in that particular case, was actually fiercely partisan for Ukraine and against Russia, which would normally be a red flag. But of course, whatever he found was based on public sources and could be checked and verified. It takes hours of time to make the first match, but much less time to check whether or not it's valid, which it was. Eliot Higgins suggested that it's effectively the scientific method applied to journalism. It should all be able to be replicated. At least the part of journalism that's about verifying facts anyway. And it meant that a picture was starting to emerge. According to Vitaly Nadia, the Ukrainian counter-terrorism chief, communications had been intercepted suggesting that the Buk missile launcher had come from Russia, crossing the border in the middle of the night. That had yet to be verified. But what they had so far was at least compatible with that version. So from those multiple sightings, they could establish the timeline as this. 9 a.m. The Buk was in Donetsk, 125 miles in from the border. That's from the Paris match photo. 11:40 a.m. it was in Zuras, YouTube video, Torres at 12:30, Schnitzner at 1:30 p.m. and off the truck, Schnitzner after 1:30 p.m. leaving the town on its own tracks, which was the original YouTube video. Then a gap. The MH17 was shot down around 4:20 p.m. Then the Buk is back on the trailer going through Luhansk at around 4 a.m, heading back towards the Russian border. All of that was persuasive, but the investigators still needed more. There was a gap from it leaving Schnitzner after 1:30 p.m. and the plane coming down at 4:20 p.m. Where did it go? And they didn't have hard evidence that it came in across the Russian border with the support of the Russian military. Now that latter question picked up its first leads from a Russian living in the Netherlands, Iggy Ostanin. Remember, most of the victims on flight MH17, which left from Amsterdam, were Dutch. So it was making a huge impact on Ostanin's community. And as a Russian, he was kind of curious to see what his countrymen were saying about the event on social media. So he spent hours clicking on link after link, just reading what people were saying, until he happened upon the Instagram account of a Special Forces soldier, Gorely, who posted bragging about crossing the border to fight Ukrainians. That got him to subsequently search on any references there might be to various things, including anti-aircraft weapons, in whatever language non-experts might use to describe having seen them. After hours of scanning duds, he found a photo of a Buk on the back of a truck dated from a month before. Now, it wasn't the one that they were looking for, but the post said it had been part of a convoy that included a number of similar Buks. This was at Stary Oskole, a Russian city about 90 miles from the Ukrainian border. So now he had something to look for. And he focused his search on that specific location and started bit by bit finding more. Someone had filmed an 11-minute video outside a Magnet supermarket showing the convoy, which included a number of Buks. Ostanin noted that one of them stood out for looking a lot shabbier than the rest of them, and it had a 3-digit ID, 3'2". And he went back and looked at the Paris match photo, and the number had been painted over, but he could still just about make it out. That was the Buk that was seen in Ukraine. He used an app called Pixifly that makes it possible to search Instagram images by location, looking for others from the same area. And he found the convoy again. There again was the Buk with that ID. A dashcam video was next, and that gave him the license plates of the vehicles in the convoy, all of which ended with the number 50. And that was the number for the Moscow military district. So he went to a Russian military enthusiast forum and asked how many units within that district possessed Buk missile launchers. Just one, it turned out, the 53rd Brigade, based in the city of Kursk. On the Russian social media site The Kontakte, he found postings by a sergeant in the 53rd Brigade showing a photo of a truck from the procession. This wasn't something that you could take lightly. Bear in mind, Eliot Higgins described how all of this felt at the time. What he had found was huge and nerve-wracking. When we published on Bellingcat, we would be levelling serious allegations against Russia, a major world power whose current leadership displayed both a propensity for information warfare and for violence. Our team was still in its first few months, and the Bellingcat project was on the line with every assertion we made. Before publishing, I went over Iggy's work again and again, careful to ensure that everything checked out. Iggy concluded his article with a solemn declaration: the Russian government bears responsibility for the tragedy. After that initial publication, more and more details began to accumulate. Presuming that several Russian forces members would have had to accompany the buck, they identified members and checked their social media profiles, along with those of their family and their girlfriends and friends. And what they found was what they'd hoped for: young conscripts barely out of their teens posting photos and showing off for their friends back home. Mothers and girlfriends of members of the 53rd Brigade complaining in June 2014 about the difficulty of contacting their men who were on an exercise near the Ukraine border and were not allowed to use their mobile phones. The father of one soldier proudly posted a picture of his son at the border, next to a giant road sign handily indicating the crossing point. The researchers uncovered that a buck requires a 4-man crew to operate it: a detachment commander with the rank of lieutenant, a sergeant and 2 soldiers, one the operator, one the driver. Above this crew, in the chain of command, were the 53rd Brigade commander, the battalion commander, and so on. Bit by bit, they pieced together the various pieces of evidence to gradually pin down the names of the officers, along with a chain of command going up to the person whose authority would ultimately be required for such an operation as this. Turned out to be Vladimir Putin himself. At the other side, the investigators tied down the launch site of the missile. This was done with various pieces of evidence, starting with a photo with a smoke trail that had been reportedly taken soon after the launch. The photographer gave them the raw format image file for the photo, which had the metadata confirming the date and time of when the image had been taken, and that showed it hadn't been manipulated in any way. That photo ultimately geolocated the position where the missile had been fired to a specific field, where the on-the-ground investigation confirmed that there were track marks and there were scorch marks, which also showed up in satellite photos. All of this represented 2 years' worth of work, and although more and more bits of evidence would emerge over time, it all confirmed this basic story. Right now, at the time of making this video, as these processes are being used to check the images that appear on social media from the war in Ukraine, the court case against the 4 men allegedly responsible for MH17 is being heard in The Hague. It's an indicator that, whatever ills we have to endure because of social media, the fact that now so many citizens, when they see something unusual or interesting, will capture and share it, has opened up new ways to gather evidence that can genuinely be used to hold people to account for their actions. So after all that, here's my take on it. I like the fact that the voluntary action around this remains focused specifically on establishing facts, not on being one of the pushers of a partisan position. Unlike traditional journalism, which often uses anonymous sources, the veracity of which you then have to trust, along with the journalist who's reporting them, this is all purely analysis of what's in the public domain, with tools that can be used by anyone to check that the results are correct. And that's a mission I associate this channel with. Higgins observed that Bellingcat has been equally willing to apply themselves to instances of Western culpability, examples being exposing the use of fraudulent corporate rules in Britain, studying Saudi-led coalition airstrikes in Yemen, and showing American and probably British arms that were probably used in violation of international law in that instance. And a major investigation into the bombing of a Syria mosque in Al Jinnah on the 16th of March 2017, the evidence around which pointed to US forces as being responsible. Nevertheless, the Putin and Assad regimes appear in investigations more frequently, says Higgins, simply because they are currently the worst offenders, leaving trails across the internet of crimes that have been committed. You'll find a link in the video description to the Bellingcat write-up of the evidence that I've covered here. Inevitably, it goes into a lot more detail than I could have covered in a short video like this. But I also recommend Eliot Higgins' book, We Are Bellingcat, where you'll find this case study, but a great deal more besides, including the stories about how Bellingcat's work has provoked the other side, which you'd kind of expect, the people who spread disinformation for whatever purpose. Higgins refers to it as the counterfactual community, and he describes it like this. Studying this community, you find a strange ideological mix. Anti-imperialists, the pro-Assad, the pro-Russian, the alt-right, the alt-left. Their belief system is marked by a pathological suspicion of the West, especially the US government. Those who oppose the West and the United States are cast as innocent victims, irrespective of their behaviour. And he concludes with this. Of course, scepticism ought to be the part of any decent investigation. Too much credulity risks grave errors, as in the acceptance of the US government's WMD, weapons of mass destruction, allegations before the Iraq War. The defining trait of the counterfactual community is not scepticism, though, but cynicism. While skeptics say prove it, cynics say who stands to gain, and invariably they already have an answer in mind. I would add that given some of the things that have been done over the last couple of years with the pandemic, it's not entirely surprising that a lot of people have found the cynical view attractive. I mean, there's a degree of cause and effect, but it is the sort of reaction that the manipulators can take advantage of. All the more reason to always look for something more robust. If mainstream media can't always be relied upon because they have too often become campaigners, not reporters, they become propagandists, then we need something that doesn't abandon standards of evidence and proof, but is independent of ideologies and interests. So rather than just jumping to the opposite extreme, we should be demanding better from the institutions that are supposed to support us. And that starts by knowing what better looks like. Arguably, this sort of principled, painstaking and verifiable process is surely at least part of the answer to that question. I mean, it can't be all the answer. Working out if a specific action was done and by whom is an important weapon to have in the armoury, but it doesn't answer questions like, is safetyism destroying our society? Were lockdowns the right policy for COVID? And is this current conflict the inevitable changing of the world order from democracy to autocracy? They are different types of questions, still needing clear analysis and a grounding in fact. Incidentally, they're also all topics that I've covered recently on this channel, none more important than that last one. If you've made it this far, you might want to watch that video next.